I want to turn now to Princeton University professor Eddie Glaude, chairman of the Center for African American Studies. He is also, of course, an MSNBC contributor. Professor Glaude, always good to have you, sir. Would be nice to have you under better circumstances, but you heard Stephen Jackson there saying change is going to start with his friend George Floyd, but it has been now more than 5 years since we saw those mass protests in Ferguson, Missouri, over the death of Michael Brown. Since then, Eric Garner, Walter Scott, Ahmaud Arbery. We could go on for the rest of the hour. Too many cases to name. Are you as confident as Stephen Jackson there that we have reached a tipping point?
Not really, Craig. And I understand his passion, but we need to read this moment as, in some ways, the consequence of a mode of policing, Craig. So when we think about the death of George Floyd, we have to put it in the context of 12 alleged misconduct on the part of that police officer, where he was not held accountable. We have to think about it within the context of a broader form of policing. For example, you can't understand the death of Laquan McDonald in Chicago without understanding what they were doing at the black site, without understanding a form of policing where folk weren't held accountable. You can't understand Chicago policing in some ways without understanding 20 years of corruption with John Burge. You can't understand what happened in LA without ramparts. You can't understand, in some ways, what is going on in the country with regards to a certain kind of policing when Jeff Sessions, releases the police departments from consent decrees. New Orleans, Cleveland, Los Angeles, Newark, Chicago. Right? So part of what I'm saying here is that when we see this kind of act, when we see this kind of devastation, it is actually the result of systemic problems in our country with regards to policing, Craig. So we have to be more, shall we say, discerning in how we talk about the ways in which certain communities are policed in this country.
I want to play just a piece of what we heard from the mayor of Minneapolis, Jacob Frey, yesterday. He was talking about Floyd's death. Here's a part of what he said.
If you had done it, or I had done it, we would be behind bars right now.
What is the right way, Professor Glaude, for leadership to handle situations like these? What should we be expecting from our mayors, from our governors, the President of the United States?
I think we just need to hold people accountable. If police can act with impunity in our communities, trot over our civil rights, treat us as if we're not valued, then these sorts of actions will eventually happen. And when they do happen, as we've seen over and over again, Craig, they get off. Eric Garner's murder, or his death, the police officer wasn't held to account. Tamir Rice's death, the police officer wasn't held to account. In fact, he got another job, even though he backed out of it later. Darren Ferguson wasn't held to account. So part of what we have to do is begin to hold folk accountable so that people can have a belief in the system, right? But we also need to think, how can I put this, Craig? And this is going to be hard to say. We have to confront the reality that every time this stuff is revealed, people clutch their pearls. Right? It happens over and over again, and people say, oh, my God, is this America? And you kind of say, well, what America are you living in? And then you have to ask the question, do they really want to change? Do they really want to see what's happening to us? Because if they do, will it reveal who they are? And that's a difficult question to grapple with.
The protests that we saw last night, and anytime I see protests like this, I'm always reminded of what Dr. King said about protesting, that it is the language of the unheard. Do you surmise that we're going to continue to see these protests until there's some charges filed?
I think so. And Craig, we need to understand that it's happening in the midst of a pandemic, right? That's disproportionately impacting Black communities. It's happening in a moment where 40 million Americans are unemployed. It's happening in a moment when thousands of folk are in food bank lines trying to feed themselves. right? And so what happens? I don't know what happens on the inside when a virus is ravaging your community, and hatred is as well, right? How does one stand straight in the midst of those winds? You know what I mean? So when we see what we saw last night, we don't know what George Floyd was trying to spend that $20 for. We don't know what his condition was, what he was trying to buy in cup foods. We know why we don't know why some of those folks are in the grocery stores or why they're in Target. We know they're angry, but we also know this is a moment where folk are increasingly desperate. And on top of that, we have the precondition of being black in this country that could lead to death at the hands of the police.
I want to contrast what we're seeing in Minneapolis with what we saw in places like Michigan, because one of the things that continues to strike me is you see these armed protesters holding these huge demonstrations at state houses. But what does appear to be different is in how law enforcement is responding to protests like that versus the protests that we've seen in Minneapolis. Why is that?
I've been grappling with this. They're showing constraint. There's one image of a man they're trying to arrest and handcuff. He has a gun, he has a weapon on his side, and he's refusing to allow them to put him in cuffs. And they're so gentle. We think about, the murder in Charlottesville, at the Episcopal Church, Dylan Roof, and how they handled him and the like. It's as if some people are accorded the rights of citizenship and other folks are just expected to be obedient. As if some folks got the right to protest and we should just be grateful. Think about it. Folk were more angry at Colin Kaepernick for taking a knee than they were with the police officers who engaged in the act. It's as if we black folk are supposed to be thankful for our positions, obedient, and we should hush up when we feel a sense of wrongdoing directed towards us. You can't help but think that. These folk ended up in the state capitol, Craig, with automatic weapons, and they were treated with kid gloves. And that's all we wanted, is just the officer to be arrested. Look what it took to get the killers of Ahmaud Arbery arrested. It reveals that for some people in this country, that our lives are just not as valued. Our voices are just not as valued, that we aren't as valued.
Professor Eddie Glaude, we always appreciate your insight and perspective, and today especially, sir. Thank you.